silence was wrong. Not the peaceful quiet Ethan Walker had expected when he'd signed the lease for the remote cabin in Greenwood Forest, but something deeper, more oppressive. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums until they ached. The kind that made you strain to hear sounds that weren't there, or perhaps sounds that were deliberately being hidden. Ethan had come here to escape 6 months of unemployment, a messy divorce, and the suffocating noise of Chicago had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains of northern Wisconsin. The cabin listing had been almost too good to be true. Historic 1890s log cabin, fully furnished, complete privacy for $100 a month. The photos showed weathered wood, stone fireplace, and windows that looked out onto endless pine trees. What the listing hadn't mentioned was the way the house seemed to breathe at night. From his very first evening, something felt fundamentally wrong. The floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned in deliberate patterns. Even when Ethan stood perfectly still, he'd be reading by the fireplace, and the wood beneath his feet would emit a low, rhythmic sound like a heartbeat trapped in timber. When he'd move to investigate, the sounds would stop abruptly, as if something below was listening to his footsteps. By the third night, the patterns became impossible to ignore. 3 soft knocks would echo from beneath the kitchen floor at exactly 3:17 a.m., followed by what sounded like scratching fingernails dragging across wood. Ethan would lie in bed, heart hammering, as the sounds moved through the house like something was mapping the layout from below. He told himself it was settling wood, maybe mice or raccoons that had found their way into the crawl space. Old houses made strange sounds, but on the 7th night, as he sat at the kitchen table paying bills, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, calling out in what sounded like distress. Ethan dropped to his hands and knees, pressing his ear to the kitchen floor. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." The words were barely audible, but they were there. Someone was beneath the house. Someone was alive. He searched frantically for access to the crawl space and found it in the corner of the kitchen. A wooden hatch, roughly 3 feet square, secured with 4 heavy-duty steel bolts. The bolts were new shiny chrome that contrasted sharply with the aged wood around them. Ethan was certain they hadn't been there when he'd moved in. He would have noticed them. More disturbing was the fact that the bolt heads were on the wrong side. These bolts weren't meant to keep something out. They were meant to keep something in. Ethan was the only one with keys to the cabin, and he'd been living alone for a week. But the bolts securing the hatch were locked from the inside, meaning someone or something had trapped itself below his feet. Sleep became impossible. Every sound, every shift of the old house made Ethan's nerves spark with electricity. During the day, he tried to rationalize what he'd heard. Maybe it was audio bleeding through from a neighbor's house, though the nearest building was 12 miles away. Maybe it was his imagination, stress manifesting as auditory hallucinations. But the bolts on the hatch were real, and they were new. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and paranoia, Ethan began a systematic search of the cabin. He'd been so eager to escape his old life that he'd barely examined his new surroundings. Beyond confirming that the electricity and plumbing worked, now he looked with the intensity of a detective, checking every corner, every shadow, every space that might hold answers. Behind a loose plank in the bedroom wall, wedged between 2 support beams, he found it. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover bore no title, just the initials CM carved into the leather with what looked like a knife. The handwriting inside was neat at first, precise and controlled, but as Ethan read deeper, the letters became increasingly erratic, slanted, desperate. The journal belonged to Caleb Morgan, and the entries painted a picture of a man slowly losing his sanity in the same cabin where Ethan now lived. The early entries were mundane weather observations, grocery lists, notes about repairs needed around the property. But by the 3rd week, Caleb's tone shifted dramatically. The sound started again last night. Same pattern as before, 3 knocks, then scratching that moves from room to room. I've checked the crawl space twice. Nothing there but dust and spider webs. But I know something's down there. I can feel it watching me. Found muddy footprints in the kitchen this morning. Bare feet, small, like a woman's. I live alone. The doors were locked. Where did they come from? The voice is getting clearer. She's calling for help. But when I call back, everything goes silent. It's like she can hear me but can't or won't respond. What happened to her? What happened in this place? The final entry was dated just 3 months ago. Written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. I can't take it anymore. She's down there. I know she is. 20 feet below the kitchen floor, that's where the sounds are strongest. I've tried everything to get to her, but the hatch won't budge. The bolts, God help me. I installed those bolts myself. I locked her in, but I don't remember doing it. I don't remember any of it. If I disappear, if something happens to me, look under 20 feet. Not for me, but for her. Her name is Rachel. Rachel Dorn, and I think I killed her. That night, Ethan set up an old camcorder he'd found in the cabin's closet, positioning it to record the kitchen hatch. He needed proof either that his mind was playing tricks on him, or that something genuinely supernatural was happening in this house. He went to bed with the camera running, hoping that morning would bring clarity. When he reviewed the footage, his hands shook so violently he could barely hold the camera steady. For hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the image flickered. Static filled the screen for several seconds, and when it cleared, the hatch was open. A pair of bare feet, pale, feminine, streaked with what looked like dirt or dried blood, stepped delicately onto the kitchen floor. The camera captured them for exactly 1 second before the feed cut to black. But when Ethan checked the hatch in the morning, it was still bolted shut from the inside. The video footage haunted Ethan's dreams. Those pale feet, the way they'd moved so carefully, so deliberately across his kitchen floor, it suggested intelligence, purpose. Not the random movement of a trapped animal or the confused wandering of someone lost. Someone or something was living beneath his house. Someone who could open locked hatches and move through spaces that should have been impossible to navigate. Ethan drove into town the next morning, his hands still trembling from too much coffee and too little sleep. The village of Greenwood was barely a village at all. A gas station, a general store, a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, and a small public library housed in what had once been someone's home. The librarian was a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and hands that shook with a slight tremor. When Ethan asked about Caleb Morgan, her face went pale. "Why would you ask about him?" she whispered, glancing around the empty library as if afraid someone might overhear. "I'm renting his cabin," Ethan explained. "I found some of his belongings. I was hoping to return them to his family." The woman, her nameplate read Mrs. Henderson, sat down heavily in her chair. Caleb Morgan never left that cabin. Young man. He vanished 3 months ago. Police searched for weeks, found his car, found his belongings, but never found him. Officially, they declared it a suicide. No body recovered, they said. But nobody in this town believes that. Why not? Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted to the windows, then back to Ethan. Because this isn't the first time someone's disappeared from that place. Been happening for decades. People rent the cabin, everything seems fine for a while. Then gone, no trace, no forwarding address, just vanished into thin air. She led him to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder marked Local History, Greenwood Cabin. Inside were newspaper clippings dating back to the 1940s, each one telling a similar story. Tenants who disappeared without warning, personal belongings left behind, cars abandoned in the driveway. But one article stood out from the rest, dated August 4th, 1987. Murder at Greenwood Cabin, woman found dead. Nitrogen monoxide arrests made. The photograph showed Ethan's cabin, though it looked different, newer, less weathered. The article described the discovery of Rachel Dorn's body, a 24-year-old artist who had been renting the cabin for the summer. She'd been found by a hiker who'd noticed a foul smell coming from the property. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, and the scene suggested she'd been held captive for several days before being killed. No arrests were ever made, and the case went cold within 6 months. They say she haunts that place now, Mrs. Henderson whispered, looking for justice, looking for peace. But justice never came, and peace, well, Peace seems to be the one thing that cabin can't provide. That evening, Ethan returned to the cabin with a crowbar, a headlamp, and enough determination to overcome his terror. If Rachel Dorn was somehow trapped beneath his house, if Caleb Morgan had discovered something that had led to his disappearance, then Ethan needed to know the truth. He positioned the crowbar under the first bolt of the hatch and began to pry. The bolts came free easier than expected, as if they'd been loosened from below. When the hatch swung open, a wave of cold, stale air rushed up from the darkness, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay. Ethan's headlamp illuminated a narrow wooden ladder descending into a space that was far deeper than any normal crawl space. Should be 20 feet down, just as Caleb's journal had indicated. Ethan found something that made his stomach lurch with horror and confusion. It wasn't a body, not exactly. It was a steel chair, bolted directly into a concrete floor, surrounded by stains that could only be blood. The chair had restraints, thick leather straps attached to the arms and legs, with chains that could be locked around a person's wrists and ankles. But most disturbing of all were the scratches in the concrete around the chair. Hundreds of them, carved deep into the floor in what looked like tally marks, as if someone had been counting the days of their captivity. Sleep was no longer an option. The image of that chair, those restraints, the scratch marks in the concrete, they burned behind Ethan's eyelids every time he closed them. He'd discovered a torture chamber beneath his house, evidence of crimes that had never been solved. Victims whose names were probably carved into missing persons reports that had long since been filed away and forgotten. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. If Rachel Dorn had been killed in 1987, why were the restraints still in place? Why was the chamber so well preserved, as if it had been maintained and used recently? And most disturbing of all, why had Caleb Morgan written about feeling guilty for Rachel's death when he would have been a child in 1987? Ethan returned to the library the next morning, demanding to see everything Mrs. Henderson had on Rachel Dorn's case. The elderly librarian seemed reluctant, but eventually produced a manila envelope filled with police photographs, witness statements, and coroner's reports. The images were disturbing crime scene photos that showed Rachel's body in the cabin's bedroom, evidence of a struggle, bloodstains that painted a picture of prolonged violence. But one photograph made Ethan's hands shake so violently he nearly dropped it. It was a wide shot of the bedroom, taken from the doorway, showing the entire scene. In the background, barely visible through the window, was a figure standing in the tree line. The person was blurry, distant, but unmistakably watching the investigation unfold. Ethan pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the figure more closely. It was a young person, maybe early 20s, with wild hair and wide, terrified eyes. The mouth was open as if caught mid-scream, and the hands were pressed against the window as if trying to get inside. Mrs. Henderson peered over his shoulder. "Nobody ever identified that person," she said. "Police figured it was just a curious onlooker. Happens at crime scenes. Sometimes people hear the sirens and come to gawk." But Ethan wasn't looking at a curious onlooker. He was looking at something impossible, something that made his blood run cold and his rational mind rebel against what his eyes were telling him. He pulled out his phone and accessed his photo gallery, scrolling until he found a picture his ex-wife had taken of him just 6 months ago. The face in the crime scene photograph, the terrified young person watching from the trees, was unmistakably Ethan Walker, 38 years before he was born. He compared the images side by side, checking every detail: the bone structure, the shape of the eyes, the distinctive scar on the left temple that he'd gotten in a childhood accident. Everything matched perfectly. It wasn't someone who looked like him, wasn't a distant relative or a coincidental resemblance. It was him, exactly as he appeared now, witnessing a murder that had occurred decades before his birth. The photograph had shattered Ethan's understanding of reality. Every rational explanation he could conceive crumbled under the weight of impossible evidence. Time travel belonged in science fiction movies, not in his actual life. Yet there he was, clearly visible in a decades-old crime scene photo, his face frozen in an expression of horror that he could now feel echoing in his present-day soul. That night, He returned to the underground chamber with new purpose. If the cabin existed outside normal temporal boundaries, if he was somehow connected to events that had occurred before his birth, then there had to be more evidence hidden. In that concrete tomb beneath his feet, he descended the ladder with his headlamp and began a systematic examination of every surface. The steel chair dominated the center of the room, but Ethan forced himself to look beyond it. The concrete walls were rough, unfinished, as if this space had been carved out hastily. And in secret, water stains ran down from the ceiling, and the air held the persistent odor of rust and decay. But in the far corner, nearly hidden in shadow, he found something that made his pulse quicken with a mixture of hope and dread. It was another door. This one was different from the wooden hatch above, steel painted a deep red that might once have been meant to look cheerful but now resembled dried blood. Next to it was an electronic keypad, old and analog, but still glowing with a faint amber light that suggested it was receiving power. From somewhere, the numbers were worn smooth by decades of use, but the device was clearly functional. Ethan stared at the keypad, his mind racing. What code would unlock it? Who had installed this system, and when? The chamber felt like it had been abandoned for years, yet the keypad suggested someone had been maintaining the electronics, keeping the power running, ensuring that whatever lay beyond that red door remained secure. Then he remembered Caleb Morgan's journal, specifically the final entry where the man had mentioned Rachel Dorn and seemed consumed with guilt over her death. If Caleb had been researching the same case, if he'd discovered the same temporal anomalies that Ethan was now experiencing, then maybe he'd also found this door. Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken of the journal. Pages there in Caleb's increasingly erratic handwriting was a date mentioned multiple times. August 4th, 1987, the day Rachel Dorn was murdered. He entered the numbers, 84087. The keypad beeped softly, and something clicked inside the steel door. It swung open with a hydraulic hiss that suggested pneumatic hinges, revealing a corridor that extended beyond the reach of his headlamp beam. The air that flowed out was different, cleaner, fresher, as if it was being filtered and circulated by modern ventilation systems. Ethan stepped through the doorway and found himself in what could only be described as a fully functional underground facility. The walls were lined with white tiles, and fluorescent lights hummed to life automatically as he moved forward. The corridor branched into several rooms, each one more disturbing than the last. The first room contained banks of monitors and recording equipment, dozens of screens showing various angles of the cabin above, both interior and exterior views. Some of the feeds were clearly live, showing his own abandoned coffee cup on the kitchen table, his unmade bed, his car parked in the driveway. But other screens showed the same locations at different times, different seasons, different weather, different people moving through the rooms. The second room was a workshop filled with tools that made Ethan's stomach turn. Restraints, syringes, surgical instruments, and devices whose purpose he didn't want to contemplate. Everything was clean and organized, as if it had been maintained by someone with meticulous attention to detail. But it was the third room that made Ethan's knees buckle with horror and disbelief. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, ranged in neat rows like a twisted gallery. Every single image was of him, sleeping in the cabin, cooking breakfast, reading by the fireplace, walking through the woods. Some were clearly recent, taken during his week-long stay, but others showed him in different clothes, different seasons, different ages, as if he'd been visiting this cabin for years without remembering it. In the center of the room sat a desk with a leather-bound ledger. Ethan opened it with trembling hands and found entries written in multiple handwritings, documenting his visits going back decades. Dates, times, behavioral observations, detailed notes about his daily routines and psychological state. The most recent entry was dated yesterday and written in handwriting he recognized as his own, though he had no memory of writing it. Subject continues to follow predicted patterns. Memory integration proceeding as planned, ready for final phase initiation. The room was silent, but not empty. Ethan stood in the center of it all, surrounded by decades of dust, the air thick with a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The dim, Flickering light bulb overhead cast long shadows on the concrete walls, and every surface whispered of something long buried, something meant to stay hidden. Against the far side of the room, tucked neatly beside a cracked CRT television and a bulky VCR, sat a plain cardboard box. On the front, in faded red marker, one word: recordings. Ethan's fingers trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside were VHS tapes, dozens of them, arranged like a silent timeline, each one labeled with a date, stretching back to the late 1980s and continuing into the present. Some had dust caked on so thick they were almost unreadable, but others looked recent to recent. One tape was labeled with a date from 3 nights ago. That was the night he'd heard the knocking. Again, that was the night the camera in the kitchen shut off at exactly 3:17 a.m. He picked it up, inserted it into the VCR, and hit play. The screen blinked, then filled with static. Slowly, an image emerged, flickering, washed in gray and green. A man stood in the middle of the frame, pacing in circles, muttering. His voice was quiet, but the fear was clear. Caleb Morgan. He was thinner than the photo Ethan had seen haunted. "I did what you asked," he whispered, as if pleading to the shadows. "I buried her. I did everything." He paused, looked. "Off screen. Let me go. Please." The footage glitched. The image jumped. Now Caleb was seated in the rusted chair, the same one Ethan had unearthed beneath the cabin. His wrists were shackled, his head bleeding, his shirt torn and stained. He screamed into the silence, a soundless scream, muffled by the decades between then and now. Blood pooled beneath his boots. He cried for someone, Rachel, before screaming again, louder. Then the camera moved, slowly, with intent. Someone was behind it. Someone breathing steadily, calmly. The lens panned left, methodical, deliberate, until it settled on a mirror. Ethan stared, frozen. The reflection in the mirror was unmistakable. It was him, not younger, not older, not distorted or ghostly. It was Ethan exactly as he was. Now, same haircut, same flannel shirt, same scar across his eyebrow. He stood behind the camera, watching. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared, cold, unblinking, silent. Then he smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of the lips. And just before the tape ended, he whispered, "Playback complete." The screen went black. Ethan ripped the tape from the VCR and stumbled backward, knocking over the box. Tape spilled out like bones from a collapsed grave. His mind reeled. That footage couldn't exist. He'd never been here before. He'd never filmed anything. And yet, he had. The proof was there, spooling out in magnetic tape and fractured memory. He looked around the room. The camera still sat in the corner, covered in dust. Same model, same tripod, same angle. He walked toward it, afraid of what he might see next. Was this all happening now? Had it already happened? Was he simply replaying a part that had already been written? As his hand reached out toward the lens, he felt it, that same soft vibration in the floorboards above. The same presence. The cycle hadn't just begun. It had already chosen him. He was no longer just the observer. He was part of the tape. Ethan didn't remember climbing the stairs. One moment he was in that room of ghosts and videotapes. The next he was back in the kitchen, the hatch wide open behind him like a mouth waiting to swallow. The tapes lay scattered around his mind, playing on loop. His own face behind the camera. Caleb screaming, the whisper, playback complete. He couldn't make sense of it. How he appeared in a recording from a time he'd never lived through. How the equipment matched the scene exactly. How every date aligned with his stay. Rationality fought for air, but something deeper, primal, had taken root. That night, he locked every door and window, not to keep anything out, but to keep something from getting back in. Still, sleep didn't come. Just more knocking, not from the hatch this time. It was coming from the walls. The next morning, Ethan did what he swore he wouldn't. He reached out for help. Using a satellite hotspot from his car, he found a message board for cold case researchers and conspiracy theorists. He posted everything he could, anonymously, about the cabin, the tapes, the journal, the voice. Minutes later, responses flooded in. Most called him delusional. But one post stood out. It was short, direct. "Greenwood isn't haunted. It's recursive. Curious, Ethan messaged the user. Their response came quickly. The cabin is a time loop, a spatial echo. It doesn't trap ghosts. It traps roles. Each new resident reenacts a cycle, unknowingly. You saw yourself because you've already played the part. Ethan stared at the screen. The theory sounded ridiculous, and yet, it explained everything. Caleb begging, Rachel's grave, Ethan behind the camera. But what part was he supposed to play now? That night, the floor vibrated again. But now there was something new, a hum, like an old projector reel spinning. The walls pulsed with it. The lights flickered. Ethan pressed his ear to the drywall. Nothing. Then he took a hammer and slammed it into the wall. Once, twice, a third time, until the plaster cracked. He tore it open with shaking hands. Behind it, instead of insulation or beams, he found glass. A tall, full-length mirror stood wedged between the studs, perfectly preserved. Its surface was cloudy, dust-coated. He wiped it clean, and what stared back was not his reflection. It was him, yes, but not mirroring. The other Ethan smiled when he didn't, tilted his head when he stayed still, and then, in one fluid motion, the reflection raised a knife. Ethan gasped and stumbled back, but there was no pain, no wound, no cut. And yet, when he looked down, a line of red bloomed across his chest, soaking into his shirt, slow and deliberate. He looked up again. The mirror was cracked, his own face staring back now, normal. But the wound was real. He staggered away, clutching his ribs. This wasn't just a haunting, this was a performance. And someone, or something, was directing it. Every act, every scream, every drop of blood had been scripted long before he ever arrived. He wasn't escaping the past. He was stepping into a role that had been left unfinished. And the mirror, the tapes, the voices, they weren't warnings, they were cues. The play was underway, the stage was set, and Ethan Walker, he was just the next actor waiting to bleed. By now, Ethan couldn't tell where memory ended and hallucination began. Every sound was suspect, every reflection an imposter. The rules of reality no longer applied within the walls of the Greenwood cabin, if they ever had. He spent the next day pacing the floor, eyes constantly flicking to corners, mirrors, and darkened windows. He kept the lights on, all of them, though they flickered erratically, like they were resisting him. He knew he needed to go back down, destroy the tapes, burn the chair, seal the hatch, erase the loop. But as night fell and shadows deepened into black, he noticed something worse, the Polaroids. He hadn't touched them, and yet they had multiplied. There were more now, dozens more, pinned to the walls underground like a grotesque family tree. Ethan forced himself to return, descending those stairs again with gasoline and matches in hand. He planned to destroy it all, but when he entered the room, the first thing he saw stopped him cold. The wall that once held only a handful of photographs was now covered top to bottom. Each photo was dated, time-stamped, and horrifyingly familiar. Ethan was in every single one, sleeping, sitting, eating, staring blankly out the window. But these weren't old. They were current. Today's date was printed beneath the newest Polaroid, August 4th, 2025. The time, 3:17 a.m. The image, Ethan, sprawled out on the kitchen floor, unmoving. His eyes were closed. Blood pooled beneath his ribs. He dropped the can of gasoline. It thudded to the ground and rolled into the corner. The photo had been taken from above, like someone or something had stood over him while he slept. He checked his phone. 1:41 a.m. Less than 2 hours until that moment would arrive. Panicked, Ethan rushed back up the stairs and bolted every door, dragging furniture against the hatch and window frames. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and pressed himself against the wall, breathing shallow, heart pounding. And then another sound from outside, digging, a slow, methodical scraping. He moved to the window and peeked through a slit in the boarded glass. Moonlight glinted off something metallic in the distance. Someone was digging behind the trees. Their back turned to the house. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, slipped out the front door, and crept toward the tree line. The smell of fresh dirt hit him before he reached the hole, and then he saw it. A grave, recently dug, shallow, and inside, a body. He dropped to his knees and pulled away the last layer of soil. The corpse was rotted, partially preserved by the cold earth, long, tangled hair, bound wrists, a familiar necklace. Ethan stared in disbelief. It was Rachel Dorn. But there was something else. He reached toward her left hand. One finger was missing, her ring finger. His stomach lurched. That same finger had been missing from his mother's hand in every photo he'd ever seen. He'd assumed it was an accident, never questioned it. But now the pieces twisted and locked into place with a click that echoed in his bones. Rachel wasn't just a forgotten murder victim. She wasn't just another name on a police report. Rachel Dorn was his mother, and the man who killed her, Caleb Morgan, wasn't just the previous owner. He was Ethan's father. Ethan fell backward, reeling from the impossible truth. It explained the familiarity, the obsession, the loop. He hadn't stumbled into this place. He'd returned. The blood in the basement, the chair, the mirror, the photographs, they were all part of his inheritance, a legacy soaked in secrets, and soaked deeper still in violence. But who had filmed the tapes? Who had placed him behind the lens? Had Caleb really killed Rachel? Or had someone forced his hand? The same way Ethan now felt himself being pushed, controlled. He looked back, toward the cabin. The lights were flickering again. It was almost time. 3:17 a.m. was coming, and the house was watching. Ethan didn't bother sleeping. There was no point. The clock above the stove ticked mercilessly toward 3:17 a.m., each minute a drumbeat closer to whatever was coming for him. He'd locked the doors, braced the windows, sealed the crawlspace hatch with chains and cinder blocks. But deep down, he knew none of it would hold. The house, or whatever inhabited it, didn't need an open door. It already lived inside the walls, inside the tapes, and now, inside him. The truths unearthed beneath the soil outside had cracked. Something open in his mind. Rachel Dorn, his mother. Caleb Morgan, his father. A family tree with no branches, just blood. It wasn't coincidence that led him here. It was design. He hadn't escaped his past. He had walked willingly into its epicenter. Still, Ethan couldn't leave without understanding one final thing. Why? Why had Caleb filmed the tapes? Why had Ethan's image appeared in footage that predated his birth? Why the loops, the mirror, reflections, the bleeding walls, and most of all, who or what was orchestrating it? The answers, he hoped, were on one last tape he hadn't dared to play. It sat apart from the others, unmarked, unboxed, placed neatly on the desk in the underground room, as if it had been waiting just for him. No date, no label, just black plastic and silence. At 2:23 a.m., Ethan descended the stairs one final time. The hatch creaked open reluctantly. The air was colder now, thick with a sour rot, like wet copper and mold. He stepped into the basement chamber, flicked on the flickering bulb overhead, and slid the tape into the VCR. Static hissed, and then, slowly, the image came into focus. It was a woman, tied to the steel chair, crying. Her voice cracked from screaming, but she still begged, "Please, Caleb, please." Her eyes, swollen, pleading, locked on the lens. "He's your son. He's just a baby. Don't let them." The screen glitched. The audio cut, then returned, louder, clearer. A figure stepped into frame. Caleb Morgan. His eyes were hollow, beard matted, clothes torn. He knelt before her, sobbing. "I don't want to do this," he said. "They'll kill him if I don't." Her cries intensified. "Then let them kill me. Just don't let this place take him too." The camera shifted again. Someone else was there, off-screen, watching. A shape moved, tall, indistinct, then a voice. Calm, deep, unfamiliar. "Do it, Caleb, the loop demands it." Caleb shook his head. "No, no more." The figure stepped forward, only their shadow visible. They raised a pistol, pressed it against Rachel's temple. Caleb screamed. The screen flashed white. When the image returned, the chair was empty. Blood pooled beneath it. Caleb sat in the corner, rocking slowly, alone. The whisper came again. "You've done well. Now bury her. Hide the key. The sun will return." Caleb looked up and straight into the lens. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he whispered. "I tried to break it." Ethan watched, breath caught in his throat. Tried to break it? Was that what all of this was? His father's attempt to derail a cycle to old name? Who was the figure in the tape? The voice, was it real? Or just the embodiment of the loop itself, a force that used blood and memory to perpetuate itself? He didn't know, but he knew now what had to be done. There would be no escape. Not for him. Not this time. But maybe he could end it. He stood, struck a match, and tossed it onto the box of tapes. Flames leapt instantly, climbing the walls, devouring years of memory in seconds. The Polaroids curled and blackened. The light bulb shattered above him. Smoke rose, thick and chemical. Ethan turned to leave, but the hatch slammed shut above him hard. He ran to it, pounded on it, screamed. Nothing, no answer, no light. The fire spread, licking the ceiling. And then, he heard it, from behind. A voice, his own, speaking from nowhere and everywhere. Playback complete. Weeks passed. The smoke from the fire had long since faded into the surrounding woods, swallowed by the trees and silence that never truly left Greenwood Cabin. There was no police report, no investigation. The structure itself remained mostly intact, charred around the base. But standing, locals said it was cursed, like they always had. But cursed places are cheap, and cheap always sells. Eventually, the cabin was listed again. Quietly, discreetly, rustic getaway, the ad read, secluded, ideal for solitude. It caught the eye of a man named Ben Rowe, young, restless, looking for a break from the digital haze of modern life. He liked the idea of being off-grid. Peace, quiet, fresh air, no distractions. Ben arrived on a warm September afternoon, keys jangling in his hand, unaware of what had happened just weeks before. The real estate agent, an older man with eyes that didn't quite meet his, handed him the paperwork quickly. When Ben asked if anyone had died there, the agent paused only a moment too long. Just rumors, he said with a polite shrug. Nothing official. Ben moved in that same weekend. At first, the cabin was exactly what he'd hoped for. Still, quiet, peaceful, for 3 days. The only sound he heard was wind in the trees and his own footsteps across the dusty wood floor. But on the third night, at precisely 3:17 a.m., he woke in the dark, heart pounding. The room silent. Then, he heard it. 3 soft knocks beneath the floorboards. He sat up, breath frozen in his lungs. The knocking came again, slow, deliberate, like a message, like an invitation. Meanwhile, beneath the floor, the basement remained, scorched but intact. The wall of photographs had begun to repopulate. One new Polaroid now hung in the center, fresh, crisp, the image, Ben sleeping in his bed, and standing over him in the shadows, camera in hand, was a familiar face. Ethan Walker. Smiling. Watching. Waiting. Playback, reset.